Danny Rivers was halfway through his third cup of coffee when the whole station shook. The mug slipped right out of his hands and shattered on the floor, sending black coffee everywhere. He'd been fixing things on mining station Theta 9 for 3 years now, and nothing like this had ever happened before. Sure, the conveyor belts broke down every other week, and the air filters always needed cleaning, but actual crashes? That was new. The alarm started blaring, red lights flashing down the corridor. Danny grabbed his toolbox from under the workbench and headed toward Bay 7. His boots crunched on the broken mug as he left. He'd clean that up later. Right now, something was banging against metal in the loading bay and it sounded expensive. Bay 7 was a mess when he got there. Smoke was pouring out of a small pod that had punched right through the outer door. The safety shields had kicked in, so at least they weren't all sucking vacuum, but the pod itself looked like it had been through hell. Scorch marks covered the hull, and parts of it were still glowing red hot. The metal was weird too, not like anything Danny had seen before. It looked almost alive, with patterns that shifted when he looked at them from different angles. Inside the pod, Princess Elira was trying not to panic. The air was getting thin, and every breath felt like she was breathing through a wet cloth. Her chest hurt. The control panel in front of her was completely dead, just a black screen with a crack running through it. She slammed her fist against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The biolock had frozen up when the pod systems failed. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She was supposed to die fighting, not trapped in a box like some animal. The assassins had come for her during the peace conference. Her guards had fought them off long enough for her to reach the escape pod, but they'd all died doing it. Captain Roth, Lieutenant Kenna, even young Private Mills who just joined her detail last month. All dead because someone wanted her thrown. The last thing her guards had done was send out a distress signal. It was a powerful one too, strong enough to reach halfway across the galaxy. Princess Elira knew that help would come. The question was whether it would come fast enough. The signal traveled through space at speeds that would make most scientists jealous. It bounced off relay stations, got amplified by communication buoys, and spread out like ripples in a pond. Within hours, it had reached some of the most dangerous warriors in known space. On the fortress world of Argentum, the Silver Paladins received the message. These weren't just soldiers. They were legends. Each one had trained for 20 years in combat strategy and honor. Their plasma lances could cut through starship hulls, and their armor could withstand direct hits from orbital cannons. Commander Volth read the distress signal and immediately ordered his fastest ship prepared. A princess in danger? This was exactly what the Silver Paladins lived for. Halfway across the sector, the tech priests of the Quantum Order were already running calculations. These brilliant minds had solved problems that stumped entire planetary governments. They had tools that could manipulate matter at the molecular level, scanners that could see through solid walls, and computers that could predict the future with scary accuracy. High Technician Mira assembled her team within minutes. They loaded their equipment onto their sleek white ship and launched toward the coordinates. In the shadows of the Obsidian Nebula, the Phantom Guard didn't even speak. They just moved. These assassins-turned-bodyguards were so skilled that most people didn't believe they were real. They could walk through walls, turn invisible, and their phase blades could cut through anything in the universe. Or so the story said. Their leader simply pointed at the star charts and the team nodded. They were already gone before most people would have finished reading the message. Back on mining station Theta 9, Danny didn't know about any of this. He was too busy walking toward the banging sounds. His toolbox rattled with every step. He'd grabbed the essentials: a wrench, screwdrivers, duct tape, his trusty can of WD-40, and some wire. That usually covered about 90% of the problems he ran into. The banging got louder as he approached the pod. Someone was definitely inside and they were hitting the door pretty hard. Danny set down his toolbox and examined the hull. The metal was cool enough to touch now, but it felt weird under his fingers. Kind of squishy like plastic but also hard like steel. Definitely not standard issue. He found what looked like a door seam and traced it with his fingers. There was a mechanism there, some kind of lock, but it wasn't moving. Danny had seen stuck doors before. Usually it was just corrosion or dirt in the gears, nothing a little oil couldn't fix. Probably another dam or holler with a stuck hatch, he muttered to himself, reaching for his toolbox. He had no idea that the person inside was royalty, or that the most elite warriors in the galaxy were already racing toward this exact spot. Danny Rivers was just a mechanic trying to help someone who was clearly having a bad day. 12 hours had passed since Danny had found the crashed pod. He tried everything he could think of to get it open, but the lock mechanism was completely frozen. Whatever was inside had stopped banging on the door about an hour ago, which worried him. He'd reported it to Station Command, grabbed some food and come back to keep trying. That's when the ships arrived. Danny had never seen anything like them. 3 massive vessels that looked like they'd been built by people who had way too much money and wanted everyone to know it. The smallest one was twice the size of the ore haulers that usually docked here, and it was covered in so much chrome and gold plating that it hurt to look at. The station's docking fees for one day would probably cost more than Danny made in a year. The airlock hissed open and out stepped the most ridiculous group of people Danny had ever seen. The first guy wore armor that was so polished it worked like a mirror. Every surface gleamed under the bay lights, reflecting everything around him. He had a weapon strapped to his back that hummed with power, and his cape flowed behind him even though there was no wind in the bay. Behind him marched 20 more soldiers, all dressed exactly the same, moving in perfect formation like they'd practiced it 1,000 times. Commander Volth of the Silver Paladins looked around the bay with the kind of expression that said he owned the place. His eyes landed on the crashed pod, then on Danny who was still holding half a sandwich. Volth's nose wrinkled slightly, like he'd just smelled something bad. "Stand back, civilian," Volth announced, his voice booming across the bay. "We will free the princess with precision and honor." Danny took a step back, more confused than anything. Princess? There was royalty in that thing? Volth unslung his plasma lance and took up a dramatic pose. The weapon started glowing, building up power until the whole thing was crackling with blue energy. Danny had seen plasma cutters before, but nothing like this. This thing looked like it could cut a battleship in half. "Witness the power of the Silver Paladins." Volth shouted and fired. The beam shot forward, bright enough that Danny had to shield his eyes. It hit the pod's hull dead center and then something weird happened. The beam just stopped. It didn't burn through, didn't even leave a mark. Instead, the energy seemed to get sucked into the strange metal, which glowed brighter and brighter until suddenly the beam shot right back where it came from. Volth dove to the side just in time. The reflected beam sliced through a support beam behind him, sending sparks everywhere. His perfect hair was slightly messed up now and his face had gone red. "Interesting," said a woman's voice. She just walked out of the second ship, surrounded by people in white coats carrying equipment that beeped and blinked. High Technician Mira looked at Volth like a teacher disappointed in a student. "Clearly a brute force approach won't work here. Allow me to demonstrate actual intelligence." She pulled out a device that looked like a scanner from a science fiction movie. It had screens and lights and parts that spun around for no apparent reason. Mira pointed it at the pod and pressed some buttons. The scanner whirred to life, making sounds that went up and down in pitch. Data started scrolling across the screen faster than anyone could read it. "The molecular structure is fascinating," Mira muttered, adjusting some dials. "I'm picking up both mechanical and organic signatures intertwined at the quantum level. If I just calibrate the resonance frequency to match the biological component, I should be able to." The scanner sparked, made a sound like a cat choking and went completely dead. Smoke poured out of the vents. Mira stared at it in disbelief, shaking it like that might help. "Impossible," she said, her voice tight. "The biological components are interfering with quantum resonance. This shouldn't be possible. The math doesn't support." "Perhaps," interrupted a quiet voice that somehow carried across the entire bay, "you both should step aside." The third group had arrived so quietly that nobody had noticed them. The Phantom Guard wore black armor that seemed to drink in the light around them. Their leader drew a blade that shimmered and flickered, like it wasn't quite solid. Phase blades were legendary, supposed to be able to cut through literally anything by shifting between dimensions. Without another word, the leader stepped forward and pressed the blade against the pod's door. For a second nothing happened. Then alarms started screaming. Red lights pulsed all over the pod's surface, flashing faster and faster. A computerized voice started counting down from 10 in a language nobody understood, but the meaning was pretty clear. "You've triggered the self-destruct protocol." Volth shouted, grabbing the Phantom Guard's arm and yanking him back. "I did no such thing," the guard replied coldly. "Your incompetent plasma discharge destabilized the system." "My incompetent?" Volth's face went even redder. "If your primitive blade hadn't interfered with the quantum matrix." "Quantum matrix?" Mira interrupted. "Do you even know what quantum means?" They started arguing, their voices getting louder and louder. More people poured out of the ships, all of them wanting to put in their opinions. Someone pulled out charts and diagrams. Another person started writing equations on a portable screen. The Phantom Guard stood silently, which somehow made everything more tense. Danny had been watching all of this from behind a support beam, finishing his sandwich. He'd seen enough corporate consultants visit the station to recognize this pattern. A bunch of expensive people showing up, making everything more complicated than it needed to be, then arguing about whose fault it was when their fancy solutions didn't work. He wiped his hands on his coveralls, picked up his red toolbox and walked straight toward the pod. The arguing stopped as people noticed him. Commander Volf held up a hand. "Civilian, this is a restricted." Danny just pushed past him. He wasn't trying to be rude, he just had work to do. Up close, he could see the door mechanism clearly now. The lock was some weird mix of mechanical parts and what looked almost like veins or tubes running through it. The whole thing was seized up solid. In the cold of space, some kind of organic fluid had crystallized, locking everything in place. He'd seen this before, kind of. Old hydraulic systems on the mining equipment would freeze up in the cold storage areas. The fix was always the same. Danny pulled out his can of WD-40, shook it a couple times and sprayed the entire mechanism. The fluid soaked into every crack and joint, working its way into the frozen organic material. He counted to 30 in his head, giving it time to work, then pulled out his wrench and gave the lock 2 solid taps. The door hissed. Then it popped open with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle. Princess Elira practically fell out of the pod, gasping for air. Her fancy clothes were torn, her hair was a mess and she had bruises on her arms. But she was alive. She took several deep breaths, coughing a little, then looked up at the person who'd freed her. She'd been expecting one of the legendary warriors. Instead, she saw a guy in grease-stained coveralls holding a wrench and a can of spray lubricant. Danny noticed she was staring and felt suddenly self-conscious. You all right, ma'am?" Behind them, all the elite warriors stood in perfect silence, their expensive equipment useless in their hands. "The molecular structure is fascinating," Mira muttered, adjusting some dials. "I'm picking up both mechanical and organic signatures intertwined at the quantum level. If I just calibrate the resonance frequency to match the biological component, I should be able to." The scanner sparked, made a sound like a cat choking and went completely dead. Smoke poured out of the vents. Mira stared at it in disbelief, shaking it like that might help. "Impossible," she said, her voice tight. "The biological components are interfering with quantum resonance. This shouldn't be possible. The math doesn't support." "Perhaps," interrupted a quiet voice that somehow carried across the entire bay, "you both should step aside." The third group had arrived so quietly that nobody had noticed them. The Phantom Guard wore black armor that seemed to drink in the light around them. Their leader drew a blade that shimmered and flickered, like it wasn't quite solid. Phase blades were legendary, supposed to be able to cut through literally anything by shifting between dimensions. Without another word, the leader stepped forward and pressed the blade against the pod's door. For a second nothing happened. Then alarms started screaming. Red lights pulsed all over the pod's surface, flashing faster and faster. A computerized voice started counting down from 10 in a language nobody understood, but the meaning was pretty clear. "You've triggered the self-destruct protocol." Volth shouted, grabbing the Phantom Guard's arm and yanking him back. "I did no such thing," the guard replied coldly. "Your incompetent plasma discharge destabilized the system." "My incompetent?" Volth's face went even redder. "If your primitive blade hadn't interfered with the quantum matrix." "Quantum matrix?" Mira interrupted. "Do you even know what quantum means?" They started arguing, their voices getting louder and louder. More people poured out of the ships, all of them wanting to put in their opinions. Someone pulled out charts and diagrams. Another person started writing equations on a portable screen. The Phantom Guard stood silently, which somehow made everything more tense. Danny had been watching all of this from behind a support beam, finishing his sandwich. He'd seen enough corporate consultants visit the station to recognize this pattern. A bunch of expensive people showing up, making everything more complicated than it needed to be, then arguing about whose fault it was when their fancy solutions didn't work. He wiped his hands on his coveralls, picked up his red toolbox and walked straight toward the pod. The arguing stopped as people noticed him. Commander Volf held up a hand. "Civilian, this is a restricted." Danny just pushed past him. He wasn't trying to be rude, he just had work to do. Up close, he could see the door mechanism clearly now. The lock was some weird mix of mechanical parts and what looked almost like veins or tubes running through it. The whole thing was seized up solid. In the cold of space, some kind of organic fluid had crystallized, locking everything in place. He'd seen this before, kind of. Old hydraulic systems on the mining equipment would freeze up in the cold storage areas. The fix was always the same. Danny pulled out his can of WD-40, shook it a couple times and sprayed the entire mechanism. The fluid soaked into every crack and joint, working its way into the frozen organic material. He counted to 30 in his head, giving it time to work, then pulled out his wrench and gave the lock 2 solid taps. The door hissed. Then it popped open with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle. Princess Elira practically fell out of the pod, gasping for air. Her fancy clothes were torn, her hair was a mess, and she had bruises on her arms. But she was alive. She took several deep breaths, coughing a little, then looked up at the person who'd freed her. She'd been expecting one of the legendary warriors. Instead, she saw a guy in grease-stained coveralls holding a wrench and a can of spray lubricant. Danny noticed she was staring and felt suddenly self-conscious. You all right, ma'am?" Behind them, all the elite warriors stood in perfect silence, their expensive equipment useless in their hands. Princess Elira was still catching her breath when someone handed her a water bottle. She drank it in 3 gulps, then looked around at the crowd of warriors surrounding her. They were all talking at once, asking if she was injured, if she needed medical attention, if she could identify her attackers. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. She was alive. That was what mattered. The celebration lasted exactly 4 minutes. The explosion came without warning. The bay doors simply blew inward in a shower of metal and sparks. The blast wave knocked everyone back a few steps. Danny hit the ground hard, his toolbox skidding across the floor. When the smoke cleared, 6 figures stood in the ruined doorway. They didn't walk in. They just appeared like they'd stepped out of the shadows themselves. Their armor was black, but not the normal kind of black. This was the kind of darkness that seemed to pull light into it and never let go. Looking at them too long made Danny's eyes hurt. They moved wrong too, kind of jerky and smooth at the same time, like they weren't quite in sync with reality. Void Stalkers. Danny had heard stories about them in the station bar. Assassins who could walk through walls, who never missed a target, who cost more to hire than most planets made in a year. He'd always figured the stories were exaggerated. Looking at them now, he realized the stories probably didn't go far enough. The leader stepped forward, and even that simple movement looked threatening. A blade appeared in his hand from nowhere, long and curved and glowing with a sickly green light. He pointed it directly at Princess Elira. "The contract is not yet fulfilled," the assassin said. His voice sounded like metal scraping on metal, barely human. "You were supposed to die in the pod. This is merely a delay." Commander Volth reacted first. He was already shouting orders before the assassin finished talking. "Silver Paladins, Formation Delta. Protect the princess." 20 warriors moved as one, forming a wall of gleaming armor between the assassins and Elira. Their plasma lances came up, already charging with that crackling blue energy. Volth himself took point, his weapon glowing brighter than all the others. "You will not touch her," he roared and fired. The beam shot forward, bright enough to leave afterimages. It should have vaporized the lead assassin. Instead, it just passed right through him like he was made of smoke. The assassin didn't even flinch. The beam hit the wall behind him, leaving a glowing hole in the metal. Volth fired again. Same result. The other paladins joined in, filling the air with plasma beams that should have turned the entire bay into molten slag. Every single shot passed harmlessly through the Void Stalkers, who started walking forward like nothing was happening. "Electromagnetic containment." High Technician Mira shouted. Her team was already moving, pulling out devices that looked like portable generators. They set them up in a triangle formation and activated them. Blue energy crackled between the devices, forming a net of electricity in the air. The assassins walked right through it. The electricity bent around them, avoiding them completely. Mira stared at her equipment in horror. "That's impossible. The field strength should be." The situation was worse than anyone had realized. Princess Elira pulled up a holographic display showing her home planet, and the news wasn't good. She had 48 hours to get back, maybe less. Her father had died 3 weeks ago, and the empire needed a ruler. Without her there to claim the throne, the whole government was falling apart. The Council of Nobles had already split into different groups, each supporting different candidates. Her cousin Richard was claiming he should be emperor because he was male. Her Aunt Victoria said she had more experience. There were at least 5 other people making claims, and some of them had already started hiring private armies. If Elira didn't get home soon, there would be civil war. Millions of people would die fighting over who got to wear a fancy crown. The station's conference room had never seen this many important people at once. Commander Volth sat at one end of the table, his armor freshly polished despite everything that had just happened. How he'd gotten all the scorch marks out so fast, Danny had no idea. High Technician Mira sat across from him, surrounded by floating screens showing data and charts. The Phantom Guard's leader stood in the corner, barely visible even in the bright lights. Princess Elira sat at the head of the table, looking tired but trying not to show it. I need to reach the Crystalline Empire within 2 days. Which of you can guarantee my safe arrival? Commander Volth stood up immediately, like he'd been waiting for this question his entire life. Your Highness, the Silver Paladins have protected 17 royal bloodlines across 2 centuries. We have escorted emperors, queens and chancellors through war zones, across hostile territories and even through black holes. Our success rate is unmatched. He gestured dramatically and suddenly the room filled with holographic images. Battles, ceremonies, famous people that Danny vaguely recognized from history classes he'd slept through. Volth walked through the projections like an actor on a stage. We have the firepower to fight off entire fleets, he continued. Our ships are armed with plasma cannons that can destroy asteroids. Our shields can withstand nuclear blasts. And our honor code means we would die before letting harm come to you. High Technician Mira made a sound that was almost a laugh. Honor code. How charming. She tapped her display, and new numbers appeared in the air. The Quantum Orders technology ensures a 0.4% mission failure rate. Do you know what that means, Commander? It means we've completed 996 missions out of every 1,000. Your honor doesn't show up in the statistics. She pulled up more data, graphs and charts that made Danny's head hurt just looking at them. Our predictive algorithms can calculate the safest route through space, accounting for pirate activity, meteor showers, solar flares and political instabilities. Our ships have cloaking technology that makes us invisible to most sensors. We don't fight our way through problems, Princess. We avoid them entirely through superior intelligence. The Phantom Guard's leader finally spoke, his voice so quiet that everyone had to lean forward to hear him. The Silver Paladins are loud. The Quantum Order is predictable. We are neither. He stepped out of the shadows just enough to be seen clearly. The Phantom Guard moves unseen, unknown, unmatched. We have protected targets that the rest of the galaxy didn't even know were in danger. We have never lost a charge. Not once. Not ever. Commander Volth's face went red. Are you suggesting that stealth is superior to strength? I'm not suggesting anything, the Phantom Guard replied. I'm stating facts. Facts. Mira cut in. You operate in the shadows because you're afraid of direct confrontation. The Quantum Order uses science, not superstition. Superstition? Volth stood up so fast his chair fell over. The Silver Paladins have been serving justice since before your order even existed. They started arguing for real then. Volth brought up ancient battles. Mira countered with technical specifications that nobody understood. The Phantom Guard just kept repeating that they'd never failed, which made the other two even angrier. The argument got louder and louder, with people interrupting each other and bringing up old grudges that apparently went back decades. Princess Elira tried to moderate, but they weren't listening to her anymore. This was about pride now, about proving which group was the best. An hour passed, then another. They ordered food and kept arguing through dinner. Danny wasn't in the conference room. He'd left after the first 10 minutes, once it became clear that nothing productive was going to happen. He had actual work to do. The fight earlier had caused more damage than just the blown bay doors. The whole station had shaken, and that meant things had broken. He was currently wedged into a maintenance shaft above the cafeteria, trying to fix the life support system. A coolant line had ruptured during the explosion, and cold air was leaking into the walls instead of circulating through the vents. He'd found the crack pretty easily. It was a clean break, probably from the vibration. Danny pulled out some epoxy putty from his toolbox, worked it between his hands until it was soft, then pressed it into the crack. He wrapped wire around the whole section for extra support, pulling it tight with pliers. Not pretty, but it would hold until he could get a replacement part ordered. He was whistling while he worked, some old song he'd heard on the radio that morning. The tune echoed in the narrow shaft. Down in the conference room, Princess Elira was getting a headache. The three groups were now arguing about something that had happened 15 years ago, something about a disputed contract and who had technically been hired first. She rubbed her temples and tried to think of a polite way to tell them all to shut up. Then she heard whistling. Faint, coming from somewhere above. She recognized the sound. It was the same person who'd been humming earlier while fixing the pod door. Danny the mechanic. Excuse me, she said, standing up. Nobody noticed. They were too busy arguing. She said it louder. Excuse me. Still nothing. Finally she just walked out. If they noticed, they didn't stop her. She followed the sound of whistling through the corridors until she found a wall panel hanging open. Inside she could see a pair of boots sticking out from a narrow shaft. You, she called up. Danny Rivers, correct? The whistling stopped. There was some shuffling, and then Danny pulled himself out of the shaft backwards, wiping his hands on an already dirty rag. His face was smudged with grease and there was cobweb in his hair. Yes, ma'am, he said, looking surprised to see her. Everything okay? You need something? Princess Elira took a breath. This was crazy. She knew it was crazy. But watching those three groups argue for hours had made something clear to her. I wish you to escort me home. Danny blinked at her like she'd just spoken in another language. Ma'am, I've got 3 more repair orders to fill. The water reclaimer in Section C is making a weird noise, and someone reported sparks coming from the lights in the south corridor. Plus I still need to clean up that coffee I spilled this morning. I need someone who solves problems, she interrupted. Her voice was firm now, the same tone she used when addressing the council back home. Not someone who creates new ones with overcomplicated solutions. Those warriors down there, they're very skilled, very trained, very expensive. But when things go wrong, they argue about whose fault it is instead of fixing it. You just fix things. Will you help me? Danny looked at her determined expression, then down at the wrench in his hand, then back at her. He sighed, the kind of sigh that meant he knew he was going to regret this. Let me grab my toolbox. When they walked back into the conference room together, the argument stopped mid-sentence. Commander Vault stared. High Technician Myra's mouth fell open. The Phantom Guard actually stepped forward out of the shadows, surprised enough to break his mysterious pose. Princess, Vault said slowly, surely you're not suggesting? I'm not suggesting, Elira said, using the same words the Phantom Guard had used earlier. I'm stating facts. Danny Rivers will escort me home. A mechanic? Mira looked like someone had just told her the laws of physics were wrong. Your Highness, with all respect, this man has no training, no weapons, no. He opened my pod when you couldn't. He defeated the assassins when you couldn't. He fixes things instead of making them worse. That's what I need. The 3 elite groups started protesting all at once, but Princess Elira's word was final. She was still royalty after all, and they had to respect her choice even if they thought it was insane. Danny just stood there with his toolbox, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The trip to the Crystalline Empire should have taken 36 hours straight through. It ended up taking almost 3 days because apparently the entire galaxy had mechanical problems that needed fixing. Danny sat in the co-pilot seat of Princess Elira's personal ship, watching stars streak past the window. The ship was nice, he'd give it that. Everything was smooth and quiet, nothing like the rattling or hollers he was used to. But he was already getting restless. He wasn't built for sitting still. 6 hours into the journey they got their first distress call. The diplomatic vessel Harmony's voice had sent out a general SOS. They were stuck at a neutral trade station, unable to leave because their docking clamp wouldn't release. It was causing a major incident because they were blocking one of the main docking bays, and other ships couldn't get in or out. Princess Elira wanted to ignore it and keep going, but Danny convinced her to stop. We've got time, he said. And if they're really blocking traffic, a lot of people are going to be mad at your empire for not helping. When they arrived at the trade station, they found a crowd of very frustrated people surrounding the Harmony's voice. The ship's captain, a tall woman named Helen, looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days. We've had 20 engineers look at it, she said, leading them to the docking bay. Nobody can figure out what's wrong. The docking clamp was a complex piece of machinery, all hydraulics and sensors and safety systems. It was supposed to release automatically when the ship requested departure, but instead it just stayed locked tight. The engineers had tried everything from manual overrides to completely shutting down the power and restarting it. Nothing worked. Danny set down his toolbox and stared at the mechanism for a while. Everyone watched him, waiting for him to pull out some fancy tool or start running diagnostics. Instead, he just walked around it, looking at it from different angles. He pressed his ear against the metal, listening. He touched various parts, feeling for temperature differences. After about 3 minutes, he stood up and dug through his toolbox. He pulled out a small container of graphite powder, the stuff people use for squeaky door hinges and sticky locks. The engineers looked at each other like he was crazy. Danny sprinkled the powder over all the joints where the clamp connected to the ship. Then he went to the manual control panel and started cycling the mechanism by hand, working it back and forth. The graphite worked its way into the joints, lubricating the metal. On the fifth cycle, something inside the mechanism clicked. The clamp released with a soft sound, and the Harmony's voice was free. Captain Helen stared at him. That's it? Graphite powder? The joints were seized up, Danny explained, wiping his hands. Probably haven't been serviced in years. The automatic system kept trying to force them open, which just made it worse. Sometimes you need to work things loose gently. The engineers all looked embarrassed. One of them muttered something about how the manual specifically said to use synthetic lubricants, not graphite. Danny just shrugged and packed up his toolbox. They got back on the road, but 12 hours later another call came in. This time it was from Starway Station, one of the most prestigious stops in the sector. They had a problem that was causing a diplomatic nightmare. A ceremonial air latch leading to the Royal Docking Bay wouldn't open, and they had 3 different ambassadors waiting to disembark. It had been 6 hours and people were getting angry. This one we actually need to stop for, Princess Elira said. These are important allies. If we ignore this, it'll cause problems later. Starway Station was impressive, all polished metal and fancy architecture. They were met by the station manager, a nervous man named Robert who kept apologizing. We've had dozens of technicians working on it, he said, practically running down the corridor. The air latch is centuries old, part of the original station. It's supposed to respond only to royal biosignatures, but it won't open for anyone. The air latch was built into a huge ceremonial archway, covered in engravings and decorative elements. There was a bioscanner next to it, a sophisticated piece of equipment that was supposed to read DNA and verify royal bloodlines. A crowd of technicians stood around it, all looking at readouts on their tablets and arguing about calibration settings. Princess Elira stepped up and put her hand on the scanner. It lit up, clearly reading her DNA, but the door didn't budge. She tried again. Nothing. The technician started explaining about quantum bioresonance and genetic markers and a bunch of other technical terms that went over Danny's head. They'd tried recalibrating the scanner, replacing components, even pulling up the original programming from 200 years ago. One guy suggested they might need to call in a specialist from the manufacturer's homeworld, which would take weeks. Danny walked up to the scanner while they were talking and looked at it closely. Then he leaned in and squinted at the sensor plate where people put their hands. You got any rubbing alcohol? He asked. Robert blinked. What? Rubbing alcohol. And maybe a cotton swab. Someone ran to get the supplies, looking confused. When they came back, Danny poured some alcohol on the cotton swab and started cleaning the sensor plate. Years of accumulated dust, skin oils, and general grime came off on the swab, which turned gray almost immediately. He used 3 swabs to get it completely clean, then stepped back. Try it now, he said. Princess Elira put her hand on the scanner again. It beeped once, then the massive air latch swung open smoothly. The technician stood there in silence, staring at the open door, then at the dirty cotton swabs in Danny's hand. It was just dirty, Danny said. Sensor couldn't get a clear reading through all that gunk. One of the technicians looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole. They'd spent hours on advanced diagnostics when the problem was literally just dirt on the scanner. Finally, after 2 more days of travel and 1 more quick stop to fix a stuck fuel port using a rubber mallet, they reached the Crystalline Empire. Danny had never seen anything like it. The whole planet seemed to glow, with cities made of materials that caught the light and scattered it in rainbow patterns. It was beautiful and more than a little overwhelming. The palace was even more impressive up close. It sat on a mountain overlooking the capital city, built from the same crystalline materials as everything else. But when they approached, Danny saw the problem immediately. The main gates were closed and a huge crowd had gathered in front of them. Princess Elira's face went pale. The ceremonial gates, she whispered. They're supposed to open for the rightful heir. If they don't open, what happens? Danny asked. Then the council can claim I'm not legitimate. That the throne rejects me. They landed in the courtyard and the crowd parted to let them through. Danny could see reporters with cameras, nobles in fancy clothes, and what looked like half the government standing around watching. At the front of the crowd was an old man in elaborate robes who introduced himself as Chancellor Marcus. Princess Elira, he said, and his tone made it clear he wasn't happy to see her. The gates have not opened. We attempted to conduct your coronation rehearsal 3 days ago, but they remain sealed. Perhaps this is a sign that... Let me through, Elira said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. She walked up to the gates, which towered 300 feet above them. They were made of crystalline metal that nobody had been able to replicate since they were built 2 centuries ago. She placed both hands on them and pushed. Nothing happened. The crowd started murmuring. Some people looked sympathetic, but others looked smug, like this was exactly what they'd expected. "We've had engineers examine the gates," Chancellor Marcus continued. "Court mages attempted to open them with traditional ceremonies. Scholars have been debating the metaphysical implications. All have failed. Perhaps the throne itself is rejecting." "Hang on," Danny said, stepping forward with his toolbox. The crowd went quiet, staring at this random human in coveralls. He walked up to the gates and examined the massive hinges. They were each the size of a car, intricate mechanisms that must have been engineering marvels when they were built. Danny ran his hand along one of them and felt the problem immediately. Corrosion. Centuries of it, built up in layers so thick they'd basically welded the hinges shut. He pulled out his can of WD-40 and shook it. Almost empty, just a little bit sloshing around at the bottom. He'd been using it for 3 days straight and this was the last of it. He hoped it would be enough. Danny sprayed the hinges as liberally as he could, working the nozzle until the can wheezed and gave up its last drops. The liquid ran down into the corroded mechanisms, working its way into decades of buildup. He checked his watch and waited 2 full minutes while everyone stared at him like he was insane. Then he put his shoulder against one of the gates and pushed. For a second nothing happened. Then there was a groan, deep and loud, like the planet itself was waking up. The corrosion broke free and the gate started to move. Slowly at first, then faster, until it swung fully open with a sound that echoed across the entire courtyard. The crowd erupted in cheers. People were shouting, crying, hugging each other. Someone started chanting Elira's name, and soon everyone joined in. Danny stepped back, slightly overwhelmed by the noise. Princess Elira turned to him, and there were tears running down her face. "You did it," she said. "The prophecy. You fulfilled the prophecy." "I just cleaned some hinges," Danny said, but she wasn't listening. Neither was anyone else. As far as they were concerned, the gate's opening was proof that she was the rightful ruler. The coronation happened that same day. It was a huge ceremony with thousands of people, fancy music, speeches that went on forever. Danny stood in the back, feeling out of place in his work clothes while everyone else wore silk and jewels. Afterward, now officially Empress Elira, she found him trying to sneak out to his shuttle. "Wait," she said. "I want to offer you a position. Royal Engineer with a salary of..." She named a number that made Danny's head spin. It was more money than he'd make in 10 lifetimes working on the mining station. He thought about it for maybe 5 seconds. "Thanks but no thanks," he said, shouldering his toolbox. "Someone's got to keep the coffee maker working back on Theta 9. That thing breaks down twice a week and nobody else knows how to fix it." Empress Elira smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, not one of those diplomatic smiles she'd been wearing all day. She reached into her robes and pulled out a small crystalline device. "For emergencies," she said, pressing it into his palm. "If you ever need anything at all, just press the center and I'll answer." Danny looked at the communicator, then at her. "Just emergencies," he agreed. "I'm not calling you every time the air filter gets clogged." She laughed and he headed for his shuttle. As it lifted off, he looked back once at the palace, glowing in the setting sun, then turned toward home. Down in the courtyard, Commander Volth approached the new Empress, his armor gleaming as always. "You truly chose a mechanic over the greatest warriors in the galaxy?" he asked. Empress Elira watched the shuttle disappear into the stars, becoming just another point of light. "I chose someone with the right tool for the job," she said quietly. "Perhaps you should learn the difference." Volth stood there for a long moment, thinking about plasma lances that bounced off pods, scanners that failed, phase blades that couldn't touch the enemy. Then he thought about WD-40, graphite powder, and rubbing alcohol. For the first time in his career, Commander Volth understood something important. Sometimes the greatest warrior isn't the one with the best weapon or the fanciest armor or the most impressive title. Sometimes it's just the person who knows that a simple solution beats a complicated one every single time. Back on mining station Theta 9, Danny walked into the break room and found the coffee maker leaking again. He sighed, set down his toolbox and got to work. Some things never changed and honestly he was okay with that.